Having a stepmom is already a complex situation on its own. You have to adjust to this stranger who's now supposed to be your mom, despite knowing zero things about her, and her knowing zero things about you. Should really say a lot. Now, imagine having someone younger than you to fulfill that role. It gets pretty messed up, I should say, having experienced it firsthand. Hi, I'm Mark, and I'm here to talk about a very awkward situation my dad put me in. But first, I have to give some context and background about my family for better understanding, of course. Looking back at my memories, I'd say I had a fairly decent childhood. Big house, rich family, getting whatever I wanted and more. I don't have many things to complain about. My mom was caring and nice, and despite being invested in her own career, she made sure to make time for me. My dad, on the other hand, missed out on a lot of my milestones, but it was understandable. Running a company wasn't exactly the easiest thing to do. Besides, I liked getting what I wanted back then. I guess you could say I was pretty spoiled. I grew up lazy and entitled. I never took my studies seriously because I got used to my dad just paying off my school so I could graduate. I never really had to study, just had to fail and run to my dad so he could fix it. That wouldn't last very long, though. My wake-up call that not everything was nice and peachy was when my mom ran away with a chunk of my dad's money, off to a country far enough where she could hide in luxury. There were no warnings, no goodbyes. Just woke up one day to my dad drinking in the living room with a sad, yet angry look in his eyes. I knew that would change the course of our lives forever. I just didn't know how. I was in college back when it happened, and as spoiled as I was, I failed to see how my parents' marriage had already fallen apart, long before my mom even ran away. My dad was devastated, obviously, and so was I. We grieved in our own ways. Him with work, and me. I surprisingly devoted my time to my studies. But those years of just paying to pass my subjects was hitting me harder than ever. I graduated a year late, remained unemployed for another year or two, but now at age 25, managed to land myself some small-time jobs I could handle with ease. It was nothing much, but I was proud of it. With a little more earnings and maybe a promotion, I could finally move out and try to be independent, despite my dad convincing me that I could stay for as long as I wanted. My dad and I barely talked ever since what happened, but when we do, it's simply things we thought were important to mention. Ever since Mom left, we haven't had the greatest relationship. But we were okay, I guess. On one fateful night, one of the maids told me that my dad had just got home. Earlier than his usual schedule to get off work, I would say. It wasn't that much of a shock to me, not until I was told that he wanted to see me downstairs. It was the first time after so many years that he needed my presence. I figured it could be an emergency. Maybe he was dying. I tried not to seem too eager to see him when I rushed downstairs. Thought after thought seeped into my head, considering at the moment anything was possible. Did his company go bankrupt? Did my mom come back? Was he actually dying? That one made me flinch. I hope not. I don't think I could handle losing another parent at this time. What I saw in the living room when I reached it confused me to no end. He wasn't alone. A beautiful young lady stood next to him, with long hair, wearing an expensive-looking dress that fit her perfectly. My dad entertained her with pictures that were on display in the room. I could see that they moved on to talk about a baby picture of me he had framed and displayed on a shelf long ago. My mind was in shambles. Was my dad setting me up? Why would he? He never meddled with my love life before, let alone even bother asking me about it. So what's all this? Perhaps this was a sister he had kept hidden from me? No, she didn't look anything like him. Ah, Mark, come over here. I was pulled out of my thoughts when my dad called me over. I felt his guest's eyes on me, eyeing me carefully as I slowly took steps toward him. This was unknown territory for me. But maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe this was just a job thing. Or maybe he was getting his office renovated or something. I'd like you to meet Helen. I nodded at his words as I pursed my lips in a futile attempt to give her a half-hearted smile, trying to be as polite as I could. She gave one back in return. My girlfriend. Those words were enough to freeze me in my place. I began to wonder if I even heard him right. Did he say his girlfriend or mine? I got my answer when I watched him wrap an arm around her waist, and Helen smiled at me like it was the most natural thing in the world. She held her hand and let out a cheerful greeting. "Nice to meet you, Mark. Let's get along." All throughout dinner that night, I felt like I was just floating. And so was my mind. I can't get a grasp of my thoughts, as I just kept learning and learning about Helen, who was apparently just 20 years old, and who my dad kept implying was going to be my new stepmom. I wouldn't be surprised. The way they flirted while we ate told me everything about it. Didn't know how I felt initially. It was definitely weird for sure, and it frustrated me a little how my dad didn't seem like he felt that way at all. She was young enough to be his daughter, but definitely not old enough to be my stepmom. Girls like her come and go, especially when they latch on to men as old as my dad. And despite these feelings I felt, I kept my mouth shut during dinner. I knew I had no right to meddle with his love life. And even if I felt awkward having a stepmom who was way younger than me, or him having a girlfriend long before I did, and someone barely my age too, I knew I wouldn't say anything against it. I don't think I can say anything at all. I just hope my half-hearted smiles and laughs were enough. As I expected, I saw more and more of Helen at home. At first, I only saw her if my dad was around, which happened more frequently than before now because of her. But as days and weeks went by, despite the absence of my dad at home because of overtime at work, it seemed like she wasn't leaving anymore. Like I said, I didn't have any problem with it considering we barely saw each other anyway because of my jobs, but on rare occasions that we do meet, it was insanely awkward. At least for me. But her? She was all smiles. She was very nice to me, would cook me breakfast, pack me lunch, and all that. And I knew she was supposed to be my stepmom, but the way she acted kind of felt like she was my girlfriend instead. I tried not to think much of her lingering touches on my arm, or the weird laugh she'd make whenever I say something that wasn't even supposed to be remotely funny. I know something was definitely up, but I told myself that I'm probably just reading too much into it. Admittedly, I viewed her as a gold digger, but that one was on me, and perhaps I was just being too judgmental and protective of my dad. I tried to get to know her more. Maybe that would help me see her in a different perspective. I learned she dropped out of college to be with my dad, that she didn't actually have any job at all, and would only help him with sorting out documents if he needed it. She complimented me a lot about how I look so much like my dad, and that if she hadn't met me first, she would have totally dated me instead. Things became clear to me at this point. I hated that I was right. I tried to laugh off what she was saying, letting her know that I only viewed them as a joke, but she simply insisted that it was true. She placed a hand on top of my own, and I racked my brain for excuses to leave, immediately retrieving my hand as I stood up and pretended to check my watch. Actually, I'm gonna be late for work soon, I reasoned out. Her smile seemed to have faltered a little bit, but she simply forced out another one before nodding and telling me to be safe. I hurried out of there, shrugging the feeling of both confusion and disbelief. I worked mindlessly that day, just trying to process what happened and debated if I should tell my dad. It could definitely go wrong, and he'd turn against me as if it was my fault, or I was simply making lies to make Helen look bad. But also, maybe he'd believe me. But thinking about it, if I did tell him about what happened, he was bound to lose one of us. And I've seen how she makes him happy. I'd definitely feel guilty if he'd choose me over her, but at the same time, I don't want him to lose his newfound happiness. I decided that I wouldn't say anything. Besides, it just happened once. There wasn't enough evidence that she actually likes me, and maybe she didn't mean it that way. This was just me and my wishful thinking, obviously. I avoided being alone with her on purpose. I made as many excuses as I could, purposely skipping breakfast if my dad wasn't there, purposely coming home as late and almost at the same time as my dad does, just so I wouldn't have to deal with being alone with her. She seemed to have noticed this after a while, and became just as awkward around me as well. I didn't know if this was a good thing. I couldn't help but feel guilty about it, though. I knew it was for the best. It was just sad that I genuinely wanted to have a good relationship with her for the sake of my dad's happiness. But if things continued on like that, I just don't know if I could stand it. I wasn't sure if my dad noticed things between us, but he would often encourage me to spend some time with her, to get to know her better, and that she was actually a great person if I just took the time. I didn't know what to tell him at that moment, so I just mindfully agreed. Like I said, despite not being so close to my dad ever since my mom left, I still wanted to maintain whatever it is that we had. So if this will help, then I guess I can try and work on it. I decided to drop by the kitchen for breakfast on one of my days off, even taking a deep breath before letting my presence known to Helen. She greeted me with a surprised look before gathering her composure and giving me an awkward smile. It wasn't the same as the one she gave me the first time we met, or that first time we were alone together in the very same space, which made me feel a little relieved. We stood there in awkward silence for a while, fidgeting and wondering what to say to each other. She was the first one to gather the courage to speak up about the elephant in the room, looking up at me with glassy eyes. Look, I'm sorry for what happened the other day. I hope we can put it behind us and, try and make this work? She offered a small, genuine smile. I know this is weird and all, but we can just take it one step at a time. Maybe start off as friends instead. Or something? Whatever you're comfortable with, of course. I was again relieved. And despite the skeptic thoughts that I still had towards her, I knew I was going to give this whole thing a chance. Maybe we really just got off on the wrong foot. Needless to say, I accepted her offer. She seemed sincere enough that I couldn't say no, and we both agreed that it was for the sake of my dad anyway. But of course, things don't happen overnight. We still act like we're walking on eggshells around each other. I still have my doubts towards her, obviously, but other than that, there's some minor improvements. Small talk, subtle jokes, nothing too big. Looking at the situation now, I'm still not sure if she'll last long in this relationship. Given her naiveness and reckless tendencies, it's not far from reality that she might do the same thing she did with me to other guys. And who's to say that they won't turn her down like I did? I'm not saying it will happen, but it could. But who knows? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But for now, I guess I'll just enjoy the presence of both a mom and a dad while I still can. Even if it feels a little weird.